He is kept among us in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislatures.
Welcome to Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, a podcast commemorating the 250-year anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. The show is sponsored by the American Centrum in Hamburg, Germany, and I'm your host, Andrew Sola. Britain had a total of 26 colonies in the Atlantic world in the 1700s. In addition to the 13 colonies that became the United States, there was Canada, which France ceded to Britain at the end of the 7 Years' War, as well as the other various Caribbean islands, from Barbados and Jamaica to St. Vincent and Tobago. Of course, during wartime, standing British armies were essential for defense, so they weren't really a problem in any of these colonies. But peacetime was different. Each of the colonies had a unique attitude to the presence of regular British troops, or standing armies, on their soil. For example, on the Sugar Islands, where enslaved people could outnumber free people by a margin of 10 or even 15 or even 18 to 1, the British Army was a welcome presence as a bulwark against slave revolts. However, in the North American colonies, people had long been suspicious of standing armies in their cities, towns, and villages during peacetime, and without the consent of the legislature. Even in slave colonies like Virginia, standing armies in peacetime were not that popular. And of course, in Britain itself, the British people also weren't huge fans of the concept of a standing army during peacetime. So today we're going to explore the deeply American disapproval of having soldiers stationed in their backyards during peacetime. Why were colonists suspicious of standing armies? Who were these soldiers who were stationed in the colonies? How did the presence of British soldiers inflame tensions in colonial cities such as Boston? And how did the British occupation of colonial cities like New York further alienate colonists from King George and the British Empire? Here with me today to answer these questions is a very special guest, Professor Donald Johnson. Welcome, Donald.
Thank you so much for having me.
Donald Johnson is Associate Professor of History at North Dakota State University, where he researches popular politics and the American Revolution. His book, Occupied America, British Military Rule and the Experience of Revolution, was published by University of Pennsylvania Press in 2023, and a link is in the show notes. So, Don, let's get right to it. Why don't you start unpacking that grievance against King George, grievance number 11. He has kept among us in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislatures.
Yeah, so there's two main origins of that, and the first goes really far back in English, the kind of English constitutional tradition. I mean, some scholars have argued that it goes even further back to kind of Anglo-Saxon legal traditions of when, for example, like King Alfred the Great could call up troops and when he couldn't. But for our purposes, and for the purposes of the colonists, it really goes back to the reign of Charles I in the 1600s. And Charles I was a believer in absolute monarchy. The degree to which he believed in absolute monarchy is debated amongst historians of Tudor Stuart Britain, so I don't want to kind of wade into that debate. But to some degree, he was an absolutist, and he violated a basic tenet, or what most British elites and middling sorts saw as a basic tenet of the English governmental system, or the English Constitution as it was then, which was that, first of all, kings don't keep large forces when they're not going to war, with the exception in Britain of a navy, which had been pretty necessary since time of Henry VII and Henry VIII, and certainly kind of was professionalized from Elizabeth going forward. But armies and land defenses tended to be left to the militias, and there was a very kind of robust militia system in the English counties that people took a lot of pride in, and people saw themselves. I mean, because being a colonel in your county militia or a major or a captain was a social sign of social status for a country gentleman as well as a military rank. But in any case, Charles kind of violates this agreement that the king, doesn't tax for military purposes, doesn't keep soldiers in arms when there's not a war going on, by essentially going around Parliament and raising revenues for various forces, again, kind of without that consent of the people, without going to the House of Commons, without calling Parliament into order. And this gets so bad that by the 1630s, Parliament is openly rebels against him, or at least a large faction of Parliament. And there's a horrendous civil war, which ends in Charles being executed by Parliament. And the upshot of it is a lot of it hinges on this practice of raising an army in peacetime. And the fear of a lot of these people, and England in the 1600s and for much of its history is a land kind of dominated by country squires and the gentry living out in the rural areas, even if they all come to London during the social season and during Parliament sittings. And they're afraid that this use of a standing army will be used against them, that if there's a standing army in peacetime, beyond just what's needed to kind of protect the body of the king and have a corps to raise up in case England is attacked and they need to raise regular soldiers, that army, the only use for that army would be repression, would be going after people in the countryside, preventing rebellions, things like that. And the origins of that kind of go back to the reign of Henry VIII and his children and the Wars of the Roses. But in any case, there's this deep underlying suspicion, and it's only increased by the parliamentarians themselves, because when Parliament wins that civil war, there's a coup within Parliament, and a dictator named Oliver Cromwell takes over. And for about 10 years, he does rule essentially as a military dictator. So this rebellion that started in part because of the fear of Charles I raising a standing army and using it to suppress the population turns into a group that is using a standing army to suppress the population under Cromwell and his new model army. So by the time of the Restoration in 1660, and certainly in the constitutional settlement that establishes the modern British constitutional monarchy in 1689 after the Glorious Revolution, it's really kind of in the DNA of Britons who believe in themselves as Britons that standing armies are a slippery slope towards tyranny. That once a ruler begins to amass armies, more than the just bare minimum sufficient to defend the country and kind of raise the alarm, that is kind of the first step towards a tyrannical government like Charles I, like James II, like Henry VIII or Mary I.
So what you're saying is, in the British tradition, which obviously then carries over into the colonies, the basic understanding of appropriate government is one that does allow appropriate forms of dissent, disapproval, protest against whatever it is that the government is doing, be it the king or parliament. You need to allow some of this free speech, free protest to happen, and that's kind of baked into the DNA of British culture.
Absolutely, and sometimes these protests, were violent or raucous or extra legal. There's a long tradition in English history in the early modern period of food riots when prices got too high and merchants were suspected of hoarding. And oftentimes the county militia, when called out to solve these things or to maintain order, sided with the rioters. After all, the county militias are drawn from the population. And so while they protected the purveyors of food and merchants, they often kind of negotiated with the crowd and were able to get some of these grievances alleviated. Whereas when you have situations like, for example, the Gordon riots during the American Revolutionary War, which is an anti-Catholic riot that takes place in London at the prospect of recruiting Catholic troops to fight in the American War, you have the regular British Army coming in and shooting dozens of people and really kind of breaking it up very violently. Yeah, and you say kind of it carries over to the colonists, and it does, but it also does. I mean, they're directly involved in a lot of these things. A lot of, for example, Massachusetts Puritans went back to England to fight in Parliament's army. There are several streets in Boston that are named after regicides, after people who were on the jury that voted to execute Charles I. So during the Glorious Revolution, there were battles fought and coups in favor of William and Mary in New York and in Virginia. So the colonists are part of this tradition as well, and by kind of the 1750s, 1760s, they have this kind of deep cultural memory of this, at least those of English descent.
Yeah, and I think, again, it's just important to stress the fact that the sort of danger of the standing army during peacetime is it would be misused, obviously, well, against whom? Against the people that it's supposed to be protecting.
Right. I mean, if you have a standing army and you don't have an enemy, then like why do you have that standing army, right?
Correct.
And I mean, English people could also look at their neighbors, right? I mean, absolutist France. One of the first things Louis XIV does as he consolidates his power is professionalize and expand the standing army. And I mean, granted, he's always fighting wars, so like he never really has to say it's peacetime. But part of the use of that army is on the crowds of Paris, is on the nobles who chafe at his taxes. It is kind of a double-edged sword.
Good. I kind of want to move away back from France and Britain and back to the colonies and back to the war preceding the American Revolutionary War and talk about the 7 Years' War, just in the context of having now a standing army during wartime, and maybe you could talk about the militias that were formed. We know that George Washington, for example, was in a militia. Many of the founding fathers had military experience. So maybe you can kind of talk about the good standing army that exists in the colonies during war
it's
against
interesting
France.
because there is this cooperation that works really, really well between the British Army and the colonial militias during the 7 Years' War, but there's different takeaways that both sides have. So it starts out a little rocky. The British send over a large force under one of their reputedly finest generals, William Braddock. It's supposed to march into what's now the Pittsburgh area, was then Western Virginia or Western Pennsylvania, depending on who you asked, and root out the French Fort Duquesne, this fortification that they had built in the early 1750s. And it's a disaster. The army marches super slowly because Braddock insists on taking all of his heavy siege guns, which means they have to build this really long road, which means they employ thousands of enslaved and white laborers with the army. They make a ton of noise. Fort Duquesne knows they're coming, 6 months in advance. And they're ambushed about 10 miles from the fort by a force of French regulars, Canadian militiamen, and Native American warriors, and just almost utterly destroyed. And the other thing is these redcoats are trained to kind of get in a line, raise their muskets, fire shots at enemies, 1,000 to 100 feet away until one side runs away, and they're faced with Canadian militiamen and natives firing rifles at them from behind trees and then moving to reload and then charging at them with tomahawks and retreating. And it's just total chaos. And the colonial militia that are with them saves the day. So George Washington, you mentioned, was by then a major in the Virginia militia. He had accompanied the expedition as what they called a gentleman volunteer, a kind of guide to Braddock in the local area. And he rallies both the colonists and the British forces. Braddock is shot and dies shortly after the battle, and is able to kind of make some order out of this retreat. because the Virginia militia actually knew how to fight in the wilderness. They knew how to fight in Western Virginia. They knew how to fight natives on their own turf. They knew these tactics. And in later campaigns, the British Army starts to actually learn from the colonists. So as more redcoats come to North America over the course of the war, they establish, for example, light infantry companies. These companies of people armed with rifles instead of muskets, which are longer and more accurate. These companies that are, intended to go out in skirmish line order and kind of fight from behind cover, rather than just kind of line up and shoot at the other side until someone blinks. And by the time you get to some of the major campaigns, like the campaign against Canada that ends with the Battle of the Plains of Abraham and the famous kind of fall of Quebec City, you have the colonial militia playing almost an equal part with British regulars in these campaigns. I mean, the British regulars are doing the bulk of the actual fighting and dying, but colonial militia are garrisoning forts, they are making camps, they're building roads, they're patrolling the frontiers and fighting small skirmishes with France's native allies. And they're contributing a great deal. And I think both sides kind of are developing, at least on the ground, a mutual respect and a mutual kind of learning from one another. Unfortunately, this doesn't really last the end of the war. What happens is the British leadership and the colonists kind of take away two different messages. For the colonists, the victory is because of them, because of their efforts, because they sacrificed on behalf of the crown, because they left their colonies, joined these campaigns, went to Canada, went into the Western wilderness. Some of them even end up as far as Fort Detroit and fought alongside, British redcoats. And so it gives them a stake in the victory. And what they see is also a stake in the spoils that, this war is fought against France. Britain ends up, as you said in the introduction, conquering New France almost in its entirety. And the colonists are saying, okay, now we can open up that land to white British settlements. Now, we can start doling that out so that we can have more riches. We can exploit more of the wealth of the continent. For the British, it's a different response. So for the British, they see, okay, well, we actually went in there and rescued the colonists from themselves, that it was the redcoats who did the dying and fighting. It wasn't until William Pitt took over the war in 1770 or 1757 and decided to send large amounts of money and soldiers to North America that the fortunes turned. It was all of these battles were under the leadership of British generals, and these generals kind of write back about obviously their own heroics and not the contributions of colonists, and really that the war was won by this professional British army, and so there's this peak of kind of confidence of this, and there's also this worry that if left to their own devices, the colonists will start another one of these conflicts, because there's almost this blame on the colonists for starting the 7 Years' War, which is in some ways deserved. I mean, the war starts when Washington's colonial militia from Virginia ventures into native territory and has this kind of murky encounter with French forces and native groups, that ends in violence and ultimately in a declaration of war between France and Britain. So for the British, it's necessary to kind of restrain the colonists a bit, and this kind of comes increasingly into focus as the peace settlement is being hammered out, and colonists and natives in the aftermath of 1761 and the final kind of conquest of Quebec, but before the Treaty of Paris is finally signed, you already see natives and colonists starting to butt heads. Pontiac's rebellion, for example, which takes off in late 62, early 63, is a group of Native Americans kind of pushing back against white settlers from Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia, who are saying, okay, now we've won the war, let's go settle on that land. And these Native American groups are saying, no, you won't. And then Jeffrey Amherst, the British general in charge stationed at Fort Pitt, is forced to defend the colonists because they're, fellow Britons. But he writes that, really we need to avoid this sort of thing in the future. And if we could just kind of establish clear borders between the natives and the colonists, then it would solve a lot of problems. The other argument that comes up for, and that kind of leans towards establishing a standing army in America, at least on the frontiers, is from George III himself and his own kind of view of himself as a constitutional monarch and a monarch with many different realms or many different types of subjects. After 1763, when New France and all of the territory it claimed between the Appalachians and the Mississippi is ceded to Great Britain, George is not just thinking about the Anglo colonists or the Northern European colonists or the African colonists in his original colonies. He's now thinking of the 300 or so thousand French people in New France and the 100,000 or so natives living in the kind of Ohio River Valley and the area west of that to the Mississippi as his new subjects. He's thinking of them in kind of an idealistic way for a man who never went more than 200 miles out of London. He's thinking of them in an idealistic way as subjects of the British Empire entitled to the same protections and the same due process and consideration as any other subjects, right? As Scots or Irish or even English and Welsh subjects. And so he establishes a border along the Appalachian Mountains, the proclamation line of 1763, and basically says no colonial settlements west of here and no native incursions east of here. And to enforce that, and his ministers deem that about 10,000 troops are going to be necessary to be stationed in North America at all times. And so this military establishment emerges, which is, again, a double edged sword. A lot of colonists get rich supplying the British Army, especially in Western Virginia and Western Pennsylvania. I mean, the town of Pittsburgh grows from, a tiny military settlement to not a thriving metropolis, but a prospering market town by the time of the Revolution, largely because of the presence of Amherst and the troops. But it also raises these suspicions, right? And especially because for the colonists, the French and the natives are defeated enemies. They're not fellow subjects.
Yeah, a lot of points there. One is that I just remember from the episode we did on the Quartering Act is that the standing British Army paid its bills. If it quartered itself, it would reimburse people. It would often pay, builders to build barracks and housing for them. It's not like the standing British Army was rapacious, right? And that's the kind of the example you're making out of Pittsburgh, right?
Yeah, and by the terms of 18th century armies, it was surprisingly liberal in its treatment of it. It did not live off the land like certain armies in Germany or Eastern Europe did. It tried to pack its own provisions. It shipped in provisions from Europe, and it paid fair prices for the most part for livestock, for provisions that it couldn't ship from Europe, and for housing and I mean, another point in this comes up in the occupation of urban areas before and after the revolution and during the revolution is it was sometimes socially advantageous to have a British garrison in your town. A lot of the officers lodged and rented rooms from members of the elite in these areas. And, if you had an eligible 17, 18-year-old daughter in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and a dashing, 25-year-old British major who was the third son of a Marquess, was living in your house, you could see the kind of matchmaking opportunities. They were welcomed in some sense. It's not really until colonists start to worry about British encroachment in other areas that the standing army then becomes this kind of creature of tyranny,
Yeah,
or that these suspicions, I should say, reemerge of the standing army as a creature of tyranny.
yeah, but I just think it's important kind of to balance the perspective. I think one might assume that at all times, no matter what, American colonists were deeply suspicious of the regular army, and I just think it's important to note that under many circumstances they were quite grateful to have them there. And again, the institution was not some sort of they would come in and suddenly steal everything and rape all the women. It
Yeah,
wasn't quite like that. They were on the same team, as it were, until, of course, they weren't. The second point that I wanted to just have you clarify a little bit, you said there were, so King George or his staff decide that 10,000 British regular troops need to be stationed in the 13th North American colonies, basically to prevent war between the settlers who want to move west and
hmm,
the native sovereign tribes in the Ohio Valley and west of the 13 colonies. Can you just like unpack that a little bit more for me?
yeah. So
And hold on, and I'm just asking this because I think it's really important to then specify the specific reason why a standing army in peacetime is there, and then like all the
absolutely,
consequences of that, which gets us then directly into all the grievance that we see in the Declaration of Independence.
absolutely. And again, it goes back to the end of the 7 Years' War and to some of the mixed takeaways from that war. So again, a lot of the colonists saw this as not a war of two empires, against one another, but a war about land, a war about who had control over the land of the Ohio River Valley, kind of in the near term, and who had control over land kind of west and southwest of that, modern day parts of Kentucky, Tennessee, Indiana, and even into Illinois and Michigan. And a lot of the colonists had really big plans for this land. So, for example, George Washington and a number of his neighbors in Eastern Virginia developed a land company, the Ohio Company. It's essentially secures the rights from Virginia's colonial governor to settle and sell all of the land west of the Appalachians in this kind of around the forks of the Ohio and the Monongahela rivers around modern day Pittsburgh, that they can claim, that they can survey. And Washington, as a surveyor, is cut into this deal kind of on in large part because of his skills, not necessarily because of his wealth. He's not nearly as wealthy as some of his cohorts in this. So for them, there's a lot of money at stake at this as well, and for the colonial elite. And part of the trick, because under the law, you have to either buy the land or have it kind of ceded to you by treaty from the natives. And one of the tricks that these land speculators often used was to provoke the natives into war and thereby kind of then provoke a response from the colonial government. So they'd kind of settle on native territory, even if they knew the natives would attack them or encourage settlement. The natives would attack, then they could run back to the colonial governor and say, hey, we need to raise a militia and go take out these natives. And during the treaty, they would inevitably claim more land, more native land cessions, right? And then these land cessions would be parceled out to the profit of these speculators and the government. So this had been kind of the way of doing business for much of the 1750s and into the 1760s. They see kind of an expansion of this, right? Because the sticky wicket was the French presence, was the French out there arming the Native Americans and the Canadian militiamen and fur traders who were out there kind of aiding them and supplying intelligence and doing causing all of what for these people they saw as trouble. It's why the governor of Virginia sends Washington's expedition out there in 1754 is to kind of root out some of this trouble with these relationships. And so what they're expecting is that this force will be any standing army that's stationed in North America will be there to kind of step in when these wars start and force the natives to cede more land, right? The expectation is that this is just going to accelerate without the presence of the French. And you see, wealthy people in Pennsylvania and Virginia and New York investing even more money into these land schemes because they think, oh, this is just going to pay off huge. I mean, it's also a time period where hundreds of thousands of Scots Irish are immigrating, every decade. So and Germans from distressed parts of Germany as well, from the Palatinate, for example, and so there's just immense demand for wilderness land and immense kind of hunger to go out and seize it. And then when the British kind of do an about face after Pontiac's rebellion, and they say, no, we're actually going to not use our army to defend kind of colonial squatters, but rather use it to defend the natives against colonial squatters, that becomes a real pretzel for especially a lot of these elites who are investing in the land, right? On the ground, it has a little bit of a salutary effect. I mean, it's possibly a welcome change from the violence that had convulsed the area for much of the last 2 decades. But for the people invested in these land companies, right? I mean, as soon as the proclamation of 1763 is passed, George Washington's paper title to all of this land west of the Ohio River disappears, right? And it becomes native land unless they can somehow get that restored. So it's a huge blow to what a lot of these elite colonists saw as what they were entitled to.
Yeah, so that's really important, really solid groundwork we have here to explain the presence of that standing army. Now, it is during peacetime. There is no longer war against France. Some people think it's there to protect white settlement. As it turns out, it's not. And then as the years progress after the proclamation of 1763, Pontiac's War, we start also getting these other things that piss off the colonists. The British Empire is basically bankrupt. They need to raise money. They need silver and gold. And they decide, okay, well, we're going to start passing like the Stamp Act, which is going to replenish our imperial coffers and pay for this army that we have, the standing army we have in the colonies. And so over the next decade or so, we see these tensions between the colonists and the standing army and the British Empire grow. And this takes us then into some of the very important events that directly lead to the War of Independence. And here I'm talking about the Boston Massacre, which is a result of the occupation of Boston. So let's just move the story forward here and start now focusing maybe on Boston.
Yeah, we'll flash forward about 5 years from Pontiac's rebellion to 1768. And what provokes the occupation of Boston at the end of 1768 is a riot in the city. And it's not the first one. There have been kind of a series of riots almost every year since the passage of the Stamp Act, as you alluded to, in 1765. And the riot in 1768 is, in large part, not that different from many of the others. The inciting incident is the seizure of a vessel called the Liberty, which was carrying casks of, I believe, wine that hadn't paid English duty, and the captain lied about how much cargo he had on board. The ship was seized by the Royal Navy and impounded for smuggling as part of this kind of crackdown on illegal smuggling that is part of the revenue raising program of Britain's Parliament, and that a lot of colonists are having a lot of problems with during the imperial crisis. But the Liberty happened to be owned by one of the leaders of the resistance faction, John Hancock. And Hancock, through his resistance networks, is able to raise a mob of disgruntled sailors and apprentices and kind of the lower sorts of tradesmen who run on a 3-day rampage through the town. And they burn and they loot and they pillage. And something actually that the protests in LA reminded me of when they burned that Waymo. They take the yacht of one of the British tax collectors and they burn it on Boston Square as a symbol of kind of their displeasure. And I think, some people are wounded. There's a lot of property damage. There's not that many deaths. It's by and large kind of one of these it fits largely. If it happened in another time, it probably would have fit into one of these kind of things we talked about earlier. These violent protests that often occur as a way of kind of blowing off steam and lead to kind of some kind of negotiated settlement. Instead, what happens is Parliament kind of gets word of this riot, and they read into it this kind of overstepping of the bounds of normal political activity. They see it as kind of the continuation of a pattern of resistance to parliamentary authority. And a violent resistance to parliamentary authority, and they're reading kind of the accounts of all of these tax collectors and officials who are terrified and have their families terrorized, and they decide, okay, enough is enough. We need to make an example. And what we need to do is have a heavier hand with these Bostonians. And also, part of it has to do with a little bit of historical memory and stereotypes of New Englanders. There's this idea that kind of Boston has always been kind of the problem child of the colonies, or Massachusetts in general, dating back to Plymouth and the idea of separatism from Great Britain, and then these conflicts during the English Civil War, where Bostonians and people of Massachusetts Bay largely took the side of Parliament and Cromwell, and then this kind of resistance to imperial authority that kind of is a strain in that kind of dissenting religious tradition. And so there's this idea that, okay, this is a problem in Boston. We need to make sure it doesn't spread to other colonial port towns. It's probably, and this is, the rhetoric consistently through the revolution, it's probably just a couple of like rabble rousers that we need to kind of instill the fear of God into. Let's go and encamp a British army there for a year and see what happens. And initially, that's not even kind of termed in an occupation. It's just saying we're going to take some of the 10,000 troops that we're going to station in North America, and we're going to put them in Boston. So we have them in Pittsburgh, we have them at Fort Ticonderoga, we have them in these forts throughout the colonies. We're going to put some in Boston, and about I think 3,000 or so, and see if their presence will quiet things down. And it does for a little while, and to some degree. I mean, my colleague Serena Zabin has written a fantastic book about the context of the Boston Massacre, and she finds that in large part the British Army integrated pretty well into the town over kind of the 2 years after its arrival in late 68 and before the massacre in March of 70. British soldiers had love affairs and relationships with American women, drank together in American taverns, it went in on business propositions together and kind of, engaged in these interchanges. The army had become part of kind of Boston society, but it was still this kind of symbol of the British Empire that in times of economic unrest or kind of political agitation was an easy target. And this is kind of what happens in the Boston Massacre. There's a contingent of British troops that are guarding the customs house on a snowy day. They're confronted by a mob of unemployed dock workers and apprentices and journeyman craftsmen. And essentially, these people are pissed off and blame the British because they think that these trade regulations have put them out of a job, right? That because Britain is enforcing the Navigation Acts again, and because of the Townshend duties, and because people like Hancock can no longer go to Dutch colonies or French colonies and smuggle stuff back as easily. There's not as much business, and therefore their livelihoods are in danger. So they're not thinking about taxation without representation. They're not, or at least not directly. They're not thinking about kind of constitutional principles. They're thinking, the king is costing me money. These regulations are starving my family or preventing me from advancing in my life. And so they, start throwing snowballs and hurling insults and maybe a few rocks at these British troops. And the troops start to feel threatened. And, accounts of this vary. But at the end of the day, the results speak for themselves. 5 colonists are dead, about a dozen others are wounded. And the resistance movement, which had, really up until 1774, is a tiny minority of colonists, even in Massachusetts. There's many more that are maybe sympathetic to some of their ideas, but people who are actually dedicated to resisting the British Empire are number maybe in thousands, in a population of about 2 million. They make a lot of hay out of this. They use this to say, hey, remember what we were saying about taxation without representation. Remember what we're saying about the encroaching tyranny of Parliament on our commerce. Well, now look, they've turned the standing army against us. Look, here's the inflection point where this thing that we thought was going to be here to protect us from Native Americans, that we thought was going to be here to defend our liberties, is turned into a tool to take our liberties away. And I mean, the print that almost everyone has seen of the Boston Massacre, right, is designed by Paul Revere, who's one of these dedicated resistance members, printed off and circulated, I think, within 2 or 3 weeks of the event. And it spreads, like wildfire. And so, it really wakes people up in other parts of the colonies and in Britain that says, oh my God, this is, maybe a deeper struggle than just taxes and trade regulations.
Right. And so as the social unrest and as the temperature is heating up in the colonies, obviously the empire continues to push back. And we have the Boston Tea Party and all of these other things. And eventually, and we're still not yet in 1776, but eventually martial law is instituted in 1774. So why don't you tell me about that, please?
Yeah, so martial law happens in 1774. It's a result of a series of acts that Parliament passes in response to the Boston Tea Party. So in December of 73, Bostonians go and destroy all of the tea on a ship owned by the British East India Company by dumping it into Boston Harbor. They do this to protest the Tea Act, which had given the East India Company a monopoly on selling tea to the colonists. Ironically, it would have been cheaper than the tea they were buying elsewhere, but for them, it's kind of the principle of having this tea foisted upon them. In any case, Parliament, is again kind of reaches one of these moments as they did in 1768, where they say, all right, enough is enough. The Bostonians are just crazy. They've always been crazy. They're these pig-headed Puritan, Congregationalists, religious fundamentalists. We're going to stop this once and for all. We really need to make an example out of Massachusetts Bay. And so they passed 4 laws that first closes the port of Massachusetts Bay, or of Boston, to all commerce until Boston's town council or its merchants come up with the money to repay the British East India Company the value of the tea that was destroyed. Second, they pass a Quartering Act, which I think you've already covered on the podcast, so I won't get too far into that. They pass the Administration of Justice Act, which allows for British officials who are accused of crimes in the colonies to be tried back in England. And then they pass the Massachusetts Government Act, which suspends the charter of the colony of Massachusetts Bay and institutes a military government. They appoint General Thomas Gage, who has then succeeded Amherst as commander in chief of British troops in North America, as military governor of Massachusetts Bay, with full powers not only over the military, but over the civil affairs as well. And he's granted broad leeway. He can run the civil government any way he sees fit, but the power is taken away from the people of Massachusetts as had been enshrined in the charter and granted to a military government.
Yeah, you mentioned a whole number of other events that happen that correspond to a number of other grievances that we see
Yes.
here in the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, the coercive acts, they're called the coercive acts in Britain because they're meant to kind of coerce the colonists into cooperation. When news of them arrives in America, the colonists start calling them the intolerable acts because for a lot of people, this is the last straw. And it's when news of the intolerable acts arrives that you get a series of events set into motion, like the meeting of the First Continental Congress, the emergence of local revolutionary committees, and this kind of campaign across not only mainland North America but in the Caribbean as well to kind of come to the aid of Boston. And it's a huge miscalculation on the part of the crown and Parliament. Their idea is that if they punish the Bostonians, the other colonists will fall into line because they don't want to suffer the same fate. Instead, what happens is the other colonists send hundreds of thousands of bushels of grain and hundreds and thousands of heads of livestock to feed the suffering poor of Boston. They send monetary support and they start organizing similar resistance tactics as the Bostonians had used. So instead of stifling the resistance, it expands it exponentially.
Yeah, and we see you're telling the story of this slow creep from almost exactly what the British back in Britain feared about standing armies and what
exactly.
the colonists feared. This is a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's only like one outcome for a standing army in peacetime, and that is total military tyranny, and that's it.
Yeah, and I think for the colonists, that is kind of what they're starting to see. And even colonists who had kind of prior to this seen the army as, oh, no big deal, once the intolerable acts come out, say like, oh my God, like this is why they had the standing army all along, right? Which is not the case. I mean, there's no conception in 1763 that the British are intending to use this army against the colonists, right? Except to prevent like squatters from living illegally on native land.
Maybe just one question here, kind of a technical question. Before King George and Parliament decided to send the 3,000 troops to garrison Boston and to be that presence there, were the majority of these troops were stationed on the frontier. They were not primarily in the cities, so they had a low profile.
Most of the troops in North America, there's a garrison in New York City that's mostly in Lower Manhattan and spread out on Long Island, and that's intended to be kind of almost a quick reaction force in case war breaks out in the Caribbean or somewhere else. They can get on a ship and go anywhere within a month. But yeah, and by and large, the biggest concentrations are on the frontier, are at Fort Pitt, at Fort Ticonderoga, up in Canada at Halifax, and Fort Detroit, and these kind of various frontier outposts that had been fought over during the 7 Years' War or established in its wake.
Okay, so Don, you've given us such a fantastic overview of this grievance against the standing armies, but we've kind of neglected one other important passage in this grievance, which is without the consent of our legislatures. In other words, the colonists are saying, we're not like totally against what you're doing, but if you consult with us and get our consent, maybe we can figure out some sort of accommodation. But if you don't consult with us, then we have no way of trying to figure out a solution that would also work for us. So you're forcing this down our throats when you could have talked to us and gotten our consent through our legislatures.
Yeah, and this is a corollary to the argument that a lot of colonists are making about taxes. So you read kind of Dickinson or Adams or Joseph Galloway, and they're saying to Parliament, essentially, we colonists, we're faithful Britons. We don't have a problem paying taxes to the empire. We're willing to shoulder our fair share of the burden. We're all in this together. But the taxes should come from our governments, right? So essentially, Dickinson, says, essentially, send us the bill. Tell us how much each colony owes for, common defense or for the war debt from the 7 Years' War, and we'll figure out how to raise that revenue, right? Because we know the area best, and that's the constitutional mechanism by which this should take place, right? These colonial legislatures are the king's check, the parliaments of the colonies. In fact, Joseph Galloway goes so far as to suggest an imperial parliament that would be comprised of representatives from each colony, and that would be able to act kind of as a parallel parliament where the English parliament would act for the British Isles, the imperial parliament would act to provide legislation for the king to sign for the rest of the empire. And the same is true with the military. The colonists say, well, our colonial militias are pretty darn efficient and pretty darn good at defending the colonies against Native Americans. That's arguable given the amount of wars against Native Americans that happen. But their argument here is that, we know how to raise a militia, we know how to defend our frontiers against Native Americans. We're willing to accept some help building forts. We're willing to accept, a couple of officers. We certainly want the Royal Navy around to protect our shipping, but we don't need 10,000 redcoats, right? We don't need these, people who are largely lower class folks from England and Ireland, in our midst. There's a certain amount of kind of xenophobia there too, and classism, but we'd rather rely on the model of citizen militias, the model of these county and provincial forces that we can raise in time of trouble, but that also go back to their farms, go back to their trades when these wars end, right? And when these conflicts, when the threats go away, and which are more strictly regulated legally as well, right? There are legislative and traditional boundaries about what you can do with militia. Militia can only serve for set periods of time unless there's an exception made to the law. Militia can't generally leave the colony or province that they are from without the consent of that colony's legislature. And without an explicit act by that colony's legislature saying that the militia can accompany the British Army to Quebec or Montreal. So there's this idea that, okay, if we could just do it in this way that is constitutional and in which our legislatures and our communities have a say, then we can solve this problem, right? And again, it's this idea that we're not against some of the things, and in fact, a lot of Americans are in favor of many of the imperial reforms proposed in Parliament, but it's the way that Parliament and the King's government are going about it that they oppose to, and I think that carries through with most of the grievances, honestly, in the Declaration of Independence, not just the one about occupying soldiers.
Yeah, so much of the Declaration of Independence, the subtext is, had you consulted us, we wouldn't be where we are right now. Had you really taken our complaints seriously, we wouldn't be in the position we are now in a war of independence. Professor Johnson, that was such a fascinating discussion of grievance number 11, and I know everything I wanted to know about it, and I even have more questions, but we have to end today. We didn't even discuss how this overlaps with the Navy, or in fact, the idea of why the other sugar islands, for example, really liked having the garrison there. But
and occupation plays a huge role in the war and in the war settlement too. And if anyone wants to know more about that, there's a certain book they can check out.
Right, and everyone definitely check out Professor Johnson's text. Link in the show notes. Anyway. I ask all my guests at the end of each episode just to reflect on the Declaration of Independence 250 years in the future. So what are your main takeaways looking at it now, 250 years in the future?
Yeah, it's funny. If you'd asked me that a year ago or even, maybe 2 years ago, I probably would have had a different answer. But I think for a lot of American history, we focused on the first bit. We focused on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the rights part, right? The idea that there are natural rights that everyone is entitled to. And I think that's been a positive influence on American history, right? That's inspired social movements from abolitionism to the civil rights movement to the labor movement to all of these movements that have yielded improvements in people's lives and democratized American society over the course of our history. In the last year, though, and living under an increasingly authoritarian and increasingly lawless presidency, I think the grievances and this idea of when does a free people say enough is enough? What are the signs that a government that may not have started out as authoritarian, and George III certainly did not want to be an authoritarian. He's raised as a patriot king. He's raised as this epitome of a constitutional monarch, and that's still how he sees himself, even into the 1770s and 1780s. He doesn't see himself as a tyrant, but certainly the acts of parliament and all of these things are tyrannical to the colonists. And I think, as I see, a city I lived in for 5 years, Chicago, just being lawlessly occupied by paramilitary forces, and a city I grew up next to, Washington, D.C., being quasi-lawlessly occupied by National Guard troops and the military. It gets me thinking more and more that, as events start happening and people start questioning whether or not their leaders are adhering to constitutional government or even kind of the laws that have traditionally protected the rights that we rightly focus on in the Declaration, when is the time to resist and what form should that resistance take?
Professor Don Johnson, thank you very much.
Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The pursuit of happiness.
If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to support German-American friendship, why don't you visit us at our website, americatcentrum.de, where you can become a member and donate. The American Centrum is a nonpartisan and not-for-profit institution dedicated to strengthening the transatlantic relationship. The views and opinions expressed in the episode are those of the guests or the host, not the American Centrum. We take our nonpartisan mission seriously. Therefore, we do not take any institutional positions on politics or policy. Learn more about us, become a member, and donate at americatcentrum.de. Thanks for listening.